Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome with me former President of Mexico, the Honorable Ernesto Zedillo.
Buenas noches a todos. First of all, I want to salute with gratitude and affection the members of the Gildred family, certainly and particularly Heidi Gildred, and express my recognition for what this family has done supporting this institute and many other endeavors that are very important for this region and for the Americas. I salute, of course, the president and the chairman of the organization, as well as the former presidents and chairman of the organizations, and the ambassadors here present, ladies and gentlemen. And I cannot avoid to tell you an anecdote, how I first came here to speak before an audience convened by the Institute. I think it was sometime in the late summer of 2001, and my assistant says, you have a call. From whom? From Paul Volcker. And I thought it was the other Paul Volcker, different orthography. And I took the phone, and I think I wanted to impress him, so that he knew that I was still an economist. And I started to talk about the synchronized slowdown of the economies in the world and the causes of the bust of the dot-com bubble and all that. And after a few minutes, and by the way, very early on after I left the presidency, I thought that I would follow a maxim that I once heard, I guess, from Juan Jose Arreola or Antonio Latorre saying, tributes must be only for the dead. And of course, I don't want to be in that category. So I had decided that whenever people will tell me, come here and we will give you an award, I would say, no, because I was thinking, I'm not dead, so I will not go. So anyways, after a few minutes of my boring monologue with Paul Volcker, I realized that I had got the wrong Paul Volcker. And he was so nice, careful, in conducting me to the right Paul Volcker that was intending to talk to me. And then said, in reality, I call you, Mr. President, because here at the Institute, we want to have you and also give you an award. And given my maxim, I said, I'm going to tell him no, because I don't want to be in the camp of the dead. But I said, I have been so impolite by confusing him that I cannot reject the request. So I said, yes, of course, it will be my honor to go to San Diego and to go before the audience that you are convening. So that's why I first came in 2001, a few days, sadly, after the big tragedy or the big crime of 9/11. And a few years later, of course, my very dear friend, Jeffrey Davidow, called me and said, come. We are going to commemorate another anniversary of the Institute. You should come. And I came, and I was very pleased to do it. This time, my award was a bottle of tequila and a dozen of glasses like those, which was great, very useful indeed. Right. And now, I am very happy to be in this 40th anniversary commemoration, and of course, along with all of you, to remember the founder with great affection and respect. Well, I was assigned by Richard to speak, and I read the topic, The Future of Democracy and Economic Progress in Latin America. And well, I am very sorry to tell you that unfortunately, when dealing with this topic, my outlook about our region is really much worse than the outlook I entertained when I was here either in 2001 and 2008. In fact, what we see today is that Latin America is already in the second half of what eventually will be considered another lost decade for Latin America. Around 2015, our economies started to slow down significantly, and the progress that had been made in previous years to improve the poverty and inequality in our region simply stopped, and in fact, we have been having significant regressions, not only in the growth aspect, but also as far as inequality and poverty. I think about that time, it should have been clear that we had been extremely complacent in Latin America, not realizing that we were actually riding on the shoulders of the commodity boom, meaning practically on the shoulders of China. We had the commodity boom, extraordinary revenues from that situation, and our governments started to feel that, well, we were in a takeoff situation, that our economies had started at last to not only leave far behind the previous lost decade, but that somehow we were doing quite well. Of course, this was an illusion, because once the commodity boom was over, and furthermore, once we went through the great financial crisis with relatively little pain, considered with other previous shocks that we had endured in the past from the part of the international economy, there was this sense that, you see, we are decoupled from what happens in the rest of the world. And of course, this end of the illusion was a kind of a fork in the road. There were two ways to which we could have gone. One way was to recognize that we had had an anesthetic effect from the part of the commodity boom, and that we had stopped or become lazy about further advancing the process of reforms that we had undertaken back in the 1990s, and that had allowed us to leave the lost behind, the lost decade, and then retake, given that awakening around those years of 2015, retake those processes of reform. That was one way. The other way was to lament the circumstances. We were feeling already the slowdown, and start blaming the policies of the past for the bad situation that we were facing. But unfortunately, that was, in most of our countries, the decision taken. And this way is that this was seen as an opportunity by populist and demagogue politicians to start saying, okay, what we did in the past was wrong. Whatever ills our societies, economic or social societies are enduring, have to do with the reforms that were adopted in past years, because actually our problems have a very easy solution. It's just a matter of having the will to magically, easily solve those problems, and the problems will be solved. And of course, people listen. One wants to listen, but nice things. And of course, miracles are nice things. And people want to believe miracles, which probably exist in some aspects, but not in questions, in fundamental questions of economic and social development. But in any case, I think one immediate consequence of having taken the second road was that in a very large proportion of our countries and covering a great part of our populations in Latin America, what we have seen is a revival of populism. Populism that we endure already historically in the past. Most of our countries have had traumatic and very consequential negative experiences as a result of populist governments. And when we speak, at least in Latin America, about populist governments, we can also use a synonym. Populist governments are incompetent governments, practically by definition. Governments that promise magical solutions, but in practice deliver no solutions. And what they deliver is what we have seen in Latin America: a slowdown in economic growth and a regression in whatever social progress Latin America was having. Because in the first 15 years of this century, poverty decreased in Latin America, inequality improved in most of Latin America. And I think evidence of the disaster is everywhere to be seen. But there is one aspect in which this populism and incompetence has been more brutally evident and painful. And that is a way in which the Latin American, most, not all, but most Latin American countries dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. We Latin Americans must be very ashamed that if you look at the 10 worst performing countries in the world, as far as the pandemic is concerned, and this can be measured very simply, just look at the mortality rate of the pandemic, and if you go back, let's say, to November of 2020, before the vaccines were available, shame to us that out of the 10 countries, 6 were Latin American countries. Shame to us that having 8% of the global population, we contributed with 30% of the people dead as a consequence of the pandemic. And these are the official figures. If we take into account, let's say, the deaths that were not imputed to the pandemic, but most likely were caused by the pandemic, then the numbers are even more scandalous. Along with this human tragedy of how the pandemic was managed In our region, of course, there is the economic disaster. The global economy, because of the shock on what had to be done, contracted 3%. The result of all the economies in the world was a 3% contraction. What happened in Latin America? The contraction caused by the pandemic and its sequel caused a contraction of 7%. We did considerably worse than the rest of the world. And this duality of public health and economic results, I think it's evidence of that something is really wrong and rotten about the design and the execution of economic policies in our region. Well, what we have keep hearing from these populist leaderships, again, is that all the mischiefs of Latin America have to do with things that were done in the past. Because one aspect of populism is that always somebody else must be blamed. Government, the populist government, never takes responsibility for problems. It's easier to blame the foreigners. It's easier to blame the past. It's easier to blame many things. Never take their own responsibility. And this, of course, is very consequential. Because if you don't take responsibility, then it's impossible to take the decisions to fix the problems that are being faced. And it is true that these external shocks have been very negative. We all wish they had never happened. And the ones that we are enduring now, we don't want them to happen, but they are happening. But once they happen, we have to act in consequence. And the circumstances, however, are worsened considerably when governments don't act with competency and with responsibility. And that is why we have this situation of rather negative outlook for the economic and social progress of Latin America within the next few years, because we are not seeing, at least not yet, a serious rectification of this attitude of negating the fundamental fact that the problems and ills that we have today are not due to reforms that were taken in the past, but actually to the fact that the reforms were stopped and not continued. And that's a very serious problem. It is bad what is happening as far as economic and social progress. But the problem that worries me the most is not only that we have this economic and social regression because of incompetent policies, but that we are seeing in Latin America a democratic regression. The democracy that was achieved and conquered with enormous efforts in the past. And remember, in South America, we had military dictatorships and other forms of autocracies. In other places, well, we have formal democracies, but with rather imperfect results as far as the other features that a normal democracy must have. And with great efforts, with significant reforms that were achieved by the concurrence of citizens and many political parties of every ideological orientation, we were able to conquer the democracy that had been neglected to our countries over many years. Well, tragically, what we are seeing now in many countries in Latin America, from the part of these populist governments, is a strong, decisive, frontal attack on our rather still immature democracies. And I think that is the most consequential problem and tragedy that we are facing. Because I want to submit that if Latin America has failed to converge towards development of the now developed countries, is precisely because we were never really able in many of our countries to build real democracy. Because democracy means, of course, first and foremost, to believe in democracy, but also to believe and practice the rule of law. And that has been the history of Latin America, that we never really built the institutions necessary to have a strong rule of law. So that's one problem. So what we are seeing now is that using the democracy that took so much effort to build, populist leaders have been elected in Latin America. And the first thing that they do is to start attacking precisely the democracy that allowed them to have access to power. And this is a perverse irony. You conquest power through democracy, which is fine, but then you start to working against the democracy. Populist governments have shown historically that they are very incompetent to achieve social and economic progress. But actually, populist governments have shown historically that they have a very good, quote, blueprint to undermine and destroy democracy. They have used it in the past in many places. It's a very simple blueprint. Number one, first divide society. Do whatever is needed to divide societies, to polarize public opinion, to divide the citizenship. Start creating enemies, many times artificial enemies within that society. Step number one. Of course, attack brutally by any means, even illegal means, whoever critiques and is not in agreement with the government. Something that, of course, goes about against a very principle, essential principle of democracy. So that's another thing that they do. Of course, they start expressing their disregard for the rule of law. Start promoting a culture that actually the rule of law is not that important. What is important is the goodwill, So that's a real problem, and they do it in the name of the people. Because populist leaders, the first thing that they say, I incarnate the people. I represent the people. And of course, the people is only those who support the populist leader. Those citizens that dare to be in disagreement, what are they? They are enemies of the people. And that's part of this playbook to divide and to confront societies. Next step in this well-established blueprint is to start co-opting the other powers of the state that in a democracy exist precisely to check the power of the executive branch of power. An element of democracy is the checks and balances. So what do populist leaders do? Well, start co-opting, pulling, threatening, or whatever they do, so that the other powers of the state created to check the power of the executive are nullified or simply put in the side of the executive. Needless to say, populist leaders, practically from day one, question the value of institutions. Institutions are inventions. What is important is the will of the leader. The leader knows better than institutions, and therefore their endeavor is to undermine and destroy those institutions. And I'm talking about many institutions, but there is one set of institutions that are particularly disliked and therefore attacked by populist leaders. And those are the institutions in charge of organizing in the right way electoral processes. And institutions in charge of deciding whatever controversies exist around, as they always exist, around electoral results. And this is very serious, because once this is done, then it is evident what is the intention of the populist leader. Here we are seeing, in these cases, a metamorphosis, from populism to despotism. And the question is, what is the next step? Outright dictatorship or what? And when we speak about that, we are simply speaking about the end of democracy. And I think that is precisely where our societies have to awake and draw the line. Yes, it's true, governments can be incompetent in some aspects. And through democracy, things can change. And maybe a next government, elected democratically, will have better policies. Sorry that time was wasted, but that is democracy. But what is very serious problem is when the ultimate project is to destroy democracy. Because then the hope, the opportunity to rectify is over. And I think this is right now the most serious problem we have in Latin America. I think the main endeavor must be to defend and protect and restore the democracy that we had conquered and that now we are losing. I am still hopeful that thanks to that, whatever imperfect democracy we still have, we will see at some point a return to normal democracy. And hopefully with it, we will see again in many of our countries a renewed effort to retake the processes of reform that we need to undertake to overcome this situation that I like to call a pre-development trap. which has been a secular condition of Latin America, a region that in paper has had every attribute to develop, to become part of the group of developed countries. And that, however, over and over again, our history has been a history of frustration in that respect. So my hope is that we will retake democratic normalcy, that the populist experiments, as it has been in the past in Latin America, will end up as total failures. That has been systematically the history of Latin America. As true as it is that we have been frustrated with our efforts to develop, it is also true that populist leaderships have failed, and with big tragedy in our part of the world. So I hope that when we recover that democratic normalcy, we will apply ourselves again to overcome that pre-development trap. A trap where I see is constituted by three holes or pits, if you want to call it like that. First pit is the weakness of rule of law, and perhaps the most important. Because if we were to fix that, then it will be easier to fix the other pits. The other one, of course, is inequality and poverty. And the third one, of course, is anemic growth and very slow growth also in productivity. But the first one must be rule of law and the defense of democracy. If we do that, then I think there is possibility that we can fix the other two ills of Latin America. And maybe next time, when I come back, if you invite me to another anniversary, well, I can be more positive about the outlook of a region. And it gives me some peace of mind that there are groups like this, the Institute, that were created precisely to produce ideas to overcome the historic development problems of Latin America. So don't get discouraged by my rather negative outlook about the region. The region is great. It has great opportunities, but we need to have the right governance. We need to defend and strengthen our institutions. And we must not give up on democracy. We should never do that. And I hope that will never happen. Thank you.